Hi, this is History with me, Dan. When the Civic Center, now called the XL Center, was built in the 1970s, it filled in a large section of Hartford, Connecticut's downtown, bounded by Trumbull Street on the east and Allyn Street on the west, Church Street on the north, and Asylum Street on the south. Much later, the southeast corner of the XL Center complex was replaced by the Hartford 21 apartment building, which opened in 2006. In this video, I'm going to talk about some of what used to exist along the XL Center's south or Asylum Street side. This is going back decades and even centuries before the center was built. Buildings that once stood here included the Allyn House, which was once Hartford's grandest hotel. There was also an 1897 building that from 1936 to 1963 was the home of the legendary Frank's Restaurant, until the building was destroyed in a fire. And also there were two of Hartford's fondly recalled movie theaters, Loews and the Allyn. I'll be talking quite a bit about the restaurant and the theaters later on in this video, so make sure you keep watching so you don't miss anything. But to start with, let's go back to the history of this block, starting in the mid-1800s. This section from Smith's 1855 map of Hartford County shows that the most built-up sections of Hartford at the time were east of Trumbull Street. The north side of Asylum Street, between Trumbull and Ann Streets, was still residential. It had 4 houses that were set back from the street. Over the next several decades after 1855, commercial structures would be erected in front of these houses. The first 2 of these new buildings were located just west of the corner of Asylum and Trumbull Streets, as shown on the right in a section from the 1869 Atlas of Hartford and Tolland counties. In 1857, just south of the house on the corner, Timothy Allyn erected the Allyn House Hotel, which became a great landmark of mid-19th century Hartford. Pictured on the left in 1895, it was a grand Italianate-style structure designed by the architect Octavius Jordan. The building also had spaces for shops at street level. In the next picture on the left, the hotel is shown a few years later after it was remodeled by architect Isaac A. Allyn Jr. If you want to learn more about the history of the Allyn House, check out my video on it, which I'll link to in the description below. The hotel, once the grandest in the city, suffered a decline in the 20th century, and it was torn down in 1960, over a decade before the Civic Center construction began. Just west of the Allyn House was Allyn Hall, built in 1860. I guess Allyn liked to name things after himself, because it was also erected by Timothy Allyn, and again to designs by Octavius Jordan. This theater building was quite substantial for the time, and as tall as the 5-story Allyn House next door. Like its neighbor, it also had space for shops on the ground floor. For 2 decades, Allyn Hall was Hartford's premier venue for public performances, and it hosted such famous lecturers as Charles Dickens, Mark Twain, Henry Ward Beecher, and others. Imagine being in Allyn Hall on the night of January 10, 1883, to hear Frederick Douglass give a lecture on the life of John Brown. Allyn Hall was eventually superseded by other grander theaters, but it continued as an active venue into the 20th century when it was known as the Auditorium building. By then, though, it had long been considered one of the city's worst fire traps, and on the afternoon of February 26, 1914, it was destroyed in a dramatic fire, which thoroughly gutted the historic structure. It was soon replaced by the Majestic Theater, which later became Loews Theater, which I'll talk about later in this video. The photograph of the fire on the left shows a row of shops that stood west of the destroyed Auditorium building. These shop spaces were built on Allyn family-owned property sometime between 1885 and 1895, and they were later replaced by the Allyn Theater, which I'll also talk about shortly, so stay tuned. Just west of that was a block of 3-story tall buildings erected in the 1870s, and then there were 2 more 1-story buildings just before the corner of Ann Street. As I mentioned, these various buildings were erected in front of 3 early 19th century houses. This photo, taken in the aftermath of the blizzard of 1888, shows 2 1-story buildings next to the intersection with Ann Street. First, there was the Capitol Clothing Store at 248 Asylum. Next to it, at the corner, was a building that housed a cigar dealer. This is an 1895 photo of the northeast corner of Ann and Asylum Streets. The building on the corner still housed a cigar dealer at 254 Asylum, and right at the corner, at 256 Asylum Street, was a saloon, which was advertising East India Pale Ale. The photo also shows 2 of the old houses that still existed at that point, standing just behind the commercial buildings. The house on the left, closest to Ann Street, had once been the home of Reverend Thomas Church Brownell. In 1819, he became the 3rd presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church in Connecticut, and from 1852 until his death in 1865, he was the presiding bishop of the United States Episcopal Church. As Connecticut bishop, he led the effort to establish Washington College, now known as Trinity College, and he served from 1824 to 1831 as the college's first president. Trinity's campus today is in the south end of Hartford, but in Brownell's day, it was located at the site of the current Connecticut State Capitol building, so it was not that many blocks from his Asylum Street house. We can only imagine what the bishop would have thought of the fact that an extension, later built onto the front of his former residence, would one day house a cigar dealer and a saloon. The photo here was taken just before Brownell's house and the buildings in front of it were demolished to make way for the new headquarters of the Hartford Life and Annuity Insurance Company. Originally founded in 1866, it changed its name to the Hartford Life Insurance Company upon the completion of its new 6-story building in 1897. The proposed structure, designed by F.R. Comstock, was described by the Hartford Courant on June 24, 1895. Quote, "The facing of the walls on Asylum and Ann Streets for the first story will be laid in Indiana limestone of the same quality and finish and from the same quarry as the gas company's building on Main Street. The rear and east side elevations for this story will be of gray granite from the westerly quarries. The brickwork above will be of light buff No. 1 brick, and it will be elaborately ornamented with ornamental terracotta designs and medallions, the ornamentation being freely used in the arches above the windows and in the coping at the top of the building. A great amount of architectural ironwork will be employed about the windows and balconies." Unquote. In 1913, Hartford Life merged with the Missouri State Life Insurance Company in St. Louis and vacated the building, which continued for many years as an office building housing various tenants. It was eventually renamed the Lincoln Building. For nearly 3 decades, the ground floor was home to a Hartford institution, Frank's Restaurant. Frank's first opened in 1933 in the Hotel Oxford, which had formerly been Long's Hotel, located on State Street near the old State House. The restaurant was operated by Frank Lenti, an immigrant from Italy who later settled in Glastonbury, Connecticut, where he owned land off Chestnut Hill Road that he developed as Lenti Terrace. When the Hotel Oxford was demolished in 1936 to make way for a branch of Sears, Lenti moved the restaurant to the Lincoln Building at 250 Asylum Street. In 1944, he sold the restaurant to partners Frank Parsoliti and Joseph Sapia. The two were childhood friends who decided to go into the restaurant business after hanging out at Mickey Miano's Villanova restaurant on Market Street. The year after buying the restaurant, the partners completely remodeled the interior and in 1948 expanded it after taking over the adjoining store space. Frank's soon became a popular place for politicians, business leaders, and newspaper reporters. One day, a customer at the restaurant was Ross Barnett, a lawyer who would go on to become the segregationist governor of Mississippi. In town to try a case in Superior Court, Barnett was outraged that there was a black couple eating at the restaurant. He demanded that they be ordered to leave, and when Frank Parsoliti refused, the two men scuffled, and Barnett grabbed Parsoliti by the neck. Police arrived and took Barnett off to jail, where he remained a few hours before returning to apologize. Frank's restaurant survived a damaging grease-fed flash fire in 1958, after which Parsoliti and Sapia spent quite a sum to remove every trace of the odor of smoke. But 5 years later, in the early hours of Washington's birthday, February 22, 1963, a much more devastating fire started in the basement of Frank's restaurant. And despite the efforts of firefighters to contain it, the fire worked its way up the entire building. Firefighters were still pouring in water over 24 hours later. The temperature was near freezing, and, as the Hartford Courant noted, quote, icicles decorated the ledges of the already ornate building, unquote. Nearby cars were encased in ice, and the building just to the east, next door, erected in 1920, was also coated. As for the Lincoln Building, it was quickly condemned and demolished. But Frank's restaurant would live on for over 3 more decades. First, it moved across the street to the Resolute Building at 155 to 159 Asylum Street. The partners told the Courant that they planned the new Frank's to be a more elegant version of the old one. It featured a fountain with a statue of Rebecca at the well, shown here in 1973, with the partners Sapia on the left and Parsoliti on the right, with their chef Luigi Della Fiore. The restaurant remained in the Resolute Building until 1985, when it moved next door into the new City Place building. It remained there another decade until Frank Parsoliti decided to retire at the age of 88. Let's return to the north side of Asylum Street and to that earlier fire, the one that in 1914 destroyed Allyn Hall, aka the Auditorium building. The following year, a brand new theater opened in its place, the Majestic, which was designed by Hartford architect Isaac A. Allen, Jr. The theater had a very large marquee, which was described in the Hartford Courant on January 8, 1915. Quote, the electric sign, which has been erected on the new Majestic Theater building on Asylum Street, was lighted for the first time Wednesday night and was lighted again last night. It was much admired by the thousands who passed up and down the street. It is an elaborate sign and floods the street with its brilliancy. The sign was furnished by the Federal Sign Company of New York. It is 80 feet long and 22 feet high. It is shaped like a wide-spreading letter V, so that the wording on it can be read from a considerable distance either way. On the upper part are the words Majestic Theater, and below it are 2 grooves in which movable electric letters can be inserted to spell out the names of coming attractions. Above this sign is another one 40 feet high and 5 feet wide, which is placed at right angles to the building. This sign spells out the name Majestic with a flaming torch surmounting it. There are 3,000 lights, and those in the last mentioned sign are colored and produce a beautiful effect in combination with the white effulgence of the other lights." Unquote. The theater space itself was actually located on the second floor of the new building. As the Current further noted on January 10th, quote, "The arrangement of the interior of the Majestic Theater is unusual because of the fact that the foyer is at the rear of the building, and the spectators will sit facing Asylum Street. The entrance to the theater is through a vestibule 12 feet wide, occupying the space formerly used by one of the stores in the old Auditorium building. There is a gradual rise in the floor of the vestibule until the rear of the building is reached, when a sweeping flight of steps brings the patrons of the theater into the spacious foyer. Marble treads are used for the stairs." Unquote. Further, quote, "The stage, which has a proscenium opening of 25 by 50 feet, is complete in every detail for use for vaudeville or other forms of amusement if in the future such a change from moving pictures should be deemed desirable. There are 12 boxes arranged in upper and lower tiers of 3 each. These boxes are commodious and are fitted with upholstered chairs and beautiful draperies. The walls are tinted in orange and gray, enlivened with touches of gold. The ornamental work is especially pleasing and graceful. Over the center of the main floor is a magnificent ellipse, painted on the ceiling, surrounded by a border of 84 electric lights." Unquote. For many decades, the ground floor shop space at the southwest corner of the building at 188 Asylum Street was occupied by Plymouth Lunch, which had previously been in the same location in the theater's predecessor, the Auditorium building. In 1930, local merchants who were members of the Asylum Street Boosters Association met at the Plymouth Lunch to plan a celebration for the reopening of the Majestic under new owners, the E.M. Loews Theater chain. The former Majestic remained E.M. Loews Theater for the next 40 years until it was finally demolished in 1970 to make way for the Hartford Civic Center. When it was taken down, only the Strand on nearby Main Street remained of the numerous theaters that once existed downtown. This photo was taken not long before E.M. Loews was demolished. The parking lot just east of it was where the old Allyn House Hotel had stood before it had been taken down a decade earlier. Just west of E.M. Loews was the Allyn Theater. Shown here in 1960, it opened in 1927. Built by Robert J. Allyn, who owned the nearby Allyn House, the theater replaced a building I mentioned earlier that had been erected in the 1890s. The plans for the Allyn Theater were drawn by Eugene DeRosa of New York, an Italian-American architect who specialized in the design of theaters during the Roaring 1920s. A feature of the new theater was a massive Austin organ. When the Allyn Theater opened on April 18, 1927, audiences were delighted by a program that included a demonstration by Dr. Lee DeForest of his new invention, DeForest Phonofilm, an early form of talking pictures. The evening also featured a vaudeville program and the feature picture, The Red Mill, a silent film starring Marion Davies. Shown here is the theater's original marquee. Not long after it was built, the theater was completely renovated and redecorated. It reopened in 1929 with a new state-of-the-art climate control system of a type that was previously only found in theaters in Boston and New York. The Hartford Courant described how the new system, installed by the Carrier Engineering Corporation, would artificially purify and cool the air, delivering it at a scientifically regulated temperature that would be free of chills or drafts. That system, which required a full-time attendant to adjust the valves and watch the gauges, was still in operation in the summer of '69, but in October of that year, the Allyn had its last show when the Dick Van Dyke comedy Some Kind of Nut played to an audience of 25. One of those in attendance was Bernard Stanley, who'd learned that it would be the theater's last night and made a special effort to be there because he had been in the audience on the Allyn's opening night over 42 years earlier. He told a current reporter that back in 1927 he'd been a dishwasher at the Waldorf restaurant on Union Place, and it was quite the night for him to pay 50 cents for a ticket to the theater. He noted that in those days you had to wear a coat and tie to get in. As I mentioned, between the Allyn Theater and the Lincoln Building was a row of 3-story commercial structures. They were demolished at some point in the 1950s. This photograph shows the area after the buildings were removed. On the left is the 1920 building that I showed earlier when it was covered with ice from the efforts of firefighters battling the blaze at the Lincoln Building in 1963. As we know, by 1970, this building and the 2 movie theaters on the block were gone, and work soon began on the Hartford Civic Center. And even that building has been much altered since the 70s, including, of course, the building of Hartford 21. If you've watched this video to the end, consider leaving a comment saying, "I watched all of it," and hit that like button. Check out my video on the Allyn House and my video on Trumbull Street before the XL Center. Thanks.